hour. We're excited you're with us. Looks like we've got great attendance today, and we'll get our presentation kicked off in just a moment. For those of you who may not know, WPA's work in people analytics is leading organizational intelligence about a company's unique work, its people, its behaviors, culture, and its value networks, which we're going to talk about today. WPA is really a robust cloud-based toolbox that provides leadership with clarity and evidence for decision-making in their organizations. And that may allow them to optimize their human capital, to close the strategy execution gap, which I know Kevin will talk about today, increase engagement levels, improve productivity, and more. There's really nothing else like it. Deep insight that's easy, actionable, and cost-effective. WPA North America holds this series of webinars monthly on topics of interest and features and facets of the WPA toolbox. Our next webinar will be in 2018. We've been trying to do them on the third Thursday of the month because it's easy for us to remember, and we'll be announcing those 2018 dates some point in the near future. Some housekeeping issues. Attendees will be in listen-only mode for the webinar. Please be sure to submit any questions that you may have using the questions feature of the webinar platform. My name is Tom West. I work with WPA conducting our training and certification programs and supporting our North American partnerships. Also on the line with us today is Stephen Smith. Stephen is an industrial organizational psychologist with a Fortune 500 HR and analytics background. And I'm happy to work with and introduce Kevin Schlater, who's president of WPA North America, part of the WPA global team. Kevin has more than 25 years experience in corporate and financial performance, organizational leadership, and strategic planning. So with that, Kevin, I'll turn it over to you, and let's get started.
Tom, thank you very much. So it's been a pleasure doing these this year, the 30-minute webinars, and we look forward to more in 2018, and we'll share those dates with you coming up. But today's very exciting, and today has this kind of neat little combination of simplicity and complexity in it, and we'll get to that, and I'll explain what that is in a moment as we talk about value networks. But first, let's do a little bit of a reminder of where we've been and what we're really talking about. In front of us on the screen is what we refer to oftentimes as the work gearbox, and what this really is essentially is systems thinking. In any organization or community, no matter what they're doing, there's inputs on one side of the equation, and then there's really desired outputs or outcomes on the other side of the equation. The orange circles in the middle are really what matters, because nothing of those inputs can create any output without those things in the middle. And those things are very important, and they really work together, and that's why the gears, or we use the gears symbol here. A few months ago, we talked about one of those gears in particular, and we talked about culture and involving the organization and understanding what that culture is. And we're not going to talk about that today, but if you want to go back and look at some of those webinars, they are available on YouTube or the website. And then recently, in the past couple of months, we've been talking a little bit more about the body of work and work behaviors, how things are done, what activities people use when they work within their organizations, what teams are using what behaviors, and to what degree, and their priorities. And today, when we talk about value networks, or quite simply, we can use the word networks, but we'll define that a little bit further in a minute. We're talking about relations or relationships. And these are really focused on these inter-team dependencies and communication that happens, and handoff of knowledge and value between these teams. And that's where our focus is going to be today, in these networks or value networks. WPA, we're really focused on the how, on how work gets done. So we sometimes say that we're less focused on people's wants, because we think that has a little less relevance and is more difficult to act upon. But understanding how is critical to the organization and the people at the very top of the organization, because once we understand how work is being done, it provides pretty clear line of sight to whether or not the organization is going to be able to achieve its purpose, its mission, and its strategies. And we've shared a lot of examples over the last few months, but oftentimes it's good for organizations, and they can do this in any number of ways that we've shared, of identifying how different teams work. And sometimes it can be as simple as taking a scratch pad and saying, hey, how do we work here in this team that I manage or that I lead or that I'm a part of? Sometimes you can do your more formalized processes, for example, gathering this organizational intelligence like we do and put it out and display it in a certain way. But regardless of how that's being done, we want to start with how, and we want to understand how. Because if the how does not line up with the strategies and the strategic intent and the mission and the values and purpose of our organization, we will never achieve our strategic initiatives. So let's dive right in and start to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about value networks and networks. And networks, and people use the word social networks, and those are different. So I do want to make a little bit of a distinction between social networks and value networks within our organizations. Value networks really are this. What we're talking about when we're talking about inter-team dependencies are the interactions, the communications, the relationships, and the handoff of tangible or intangible deliverables. So tangible things could be the obvious things. We're handing off reports or other goods or services that we're giving to someone or receiving from another team that we're going to do something with. We're going to add additional value to it. We're going to transfer it to a client or a customer or those types of things. The intangible deliverables, which is where we really want to understand, is knowledge sharing. So that could be two teams working together intangibly in brainstorming. And it's very difficult to see exactly what's being derived from that. So it is really important to understand that Team A and Team B are working together, and they're creating innovation by their brainstorming. When we talk about value networks, we are talking about groups or teams, not individuals. So we're really not focused on, for example, Tom West or myself, Kevin Schlueter. We're focused on the teams that we work in, because from a large management, leadership, and organization perspective, it is much more psychologically safe and easier for teams to self-identify and understand their group behaviors. That way they can contribute to how those behaviors can increase or be motivated toward better behaviors or outcomes, and also to reduce some of the waste that may be inherent in their behaviors. So we'll show inter-team value networks in the organization. As we said in the first one, we're really talking about when you talk about knowledge workers and humans, and so much of this in the advanced economies and in the industrialized world now is just simply this exchange of knowledge, sharing and building financial value between departments. So much of the people who have studied knowledge workers and researched them have been very clear that anything that is either risky or transactional, humans have been very good at mechanizing, either roboticizing, putting into a computer system, or a process that is very safe and systematic. So humans, to a certain extent, don't really add as much or increasing or exponential amounts of value in that. Where the humans really add a huge amount of value is when an exchange of knowledge happens, because that's when we figure out what client or customer problems exist in the marketplace and how we can help solve them. And that right there differentiates the haves from the have-nots in the current and future organizations in the world, their ability for the humans to create things together. And finally, when we're talking about value networks, we're talking about reliance. So which teams do we rely upon? So in my team, who do we rely upon to either get information from or give information to, or some combination of that? And that's what we're really talking about. And it's really important to know that, because it's simple to say that when we look at who we rely upon, the team itself or leaders or managers or anyone can look at that and say whether or not those reliabilities and that reliance on those teams are proper or not. And when we look at value networks with organizations, we often see things. We see teams that maybe shouldn't be reliant on each other, and maybe are the result of just legacy networks or hierarchies in the organizations, where that energy can be removed from that inter-team activity and transferred to something more beneficial.
So, Kevin, if you don't mind, just a comment to clarify what probably should be obvious, but the reason these are called value networks is because these interactions between teams and groups and departments should be creating value. They certainly take time, effort, energy, but all organizations have limited resources. So understanding where these resources are expended is really what you're getting at here, isn't it?
That's correct, and thanks, Tom. And it's good because it does differentiate from social networks, which we mentioned earlier. And although value networks certainly have social interaction, if two teams, for example, are brainstorming, there's going to be social interaction. But true social networks are really talking about real social relationships within the organization. This, and you'll see in a second how we derive some of this information, is really saying, who do you exchange value with that you can contribute more value and build exponential knowledge in the organization? Yes. So now that we have a sense or an understanding of what these networks, these value networks might be, we're going to give a little bit of insight into how to document these networks in an organization. And we show this a little bit in how we do it, but let me also share that there's a lot of different ways to be able to do this. And what I really want to make clear here is you might be surprised at how relatively simple it can be to grab this information. But we all do it, and I'll give an example. In strategic planning, for example, when a team or an organization facilitates itself, let's say they facilitate key members of the organization, some of the things these strategic planning sessions are trying to derive is, what behaviors do you have? And who do you work with? And essentially they ask, what's important here and what's not important, and what do you see? What we're really doing here is the same exact thing, except in a little bit more systematized way. And what we're trying to understand is, who do you rely upon when you work? So if you see what's on your screen in front of you now, this is a very simple question that we at WPA push out to an entire organization or a population or a location of an organization that simply asks this question. And it says, when you work during a typical week, consider who you work with and just pick these. Now these are always customized to the organization itself, but this is how you have people understand, and you put the context of them into the work that they're doing. Simple question, but there's some wonderful complexity and value that comes out of the data, which I'll show you in just a second. So you can customize your selections for the team, and you can even create internal and external selections. These on this one right here are really all internal selections of an organization that wanted to see how they were working together. But there can be external selections in there as well. And of course, someone could take this and say, you know what, I don't work really with or rely upon others as I do my job. And they can click none of the above. It always needs to be an option. Now after this,
I know you're going
go ahead,
to talk more. Well, I know you're going to talk more about this, but I guess I would just add that that's only one of the data points that we're collecting from a workforce or from an organization. We're going to show the value network analysis and talk specifically about that today, but there's lots of insight that can be gained, like you said, from a simple question, because we're looking at an entire toolbox of models and data that comes together and is made usable.
Right. And there's beauty in simplicity in the world of big data and things that I think a lot of people within these organizations rightfully get a little bit scared of because they don't understand them and it seems like a lot of work. Simple but effective is always the best answer. So the second question, and the only other question that you could use to understand and document your networks, are these two others. So given that I might strike, okay, I work with these 4 different departments or teams, however they're defined within your organization. Now rank these, the importance to your work by clicking on them. And here you can say I put together a hypothetical ranking and said the REA department is really my highest priority when I work with them. There's psychological reasons to do this. Stephen Smith is on the call. He knows organizational development. He is an IO psych person. He understands the reason for asking questions in a certain way. And essentially, each individual has to make decisions about trade-offs. So now that we prioritize them, we can go down and say, okay, with those 4 departments that you rely upon and work with in your work activity, now let's talk a little bit about how you interact. Do you tend to do it physically in person? Or do you tend to do it virtually or somewhere in between? And so these last 2 pages that I showed, this one and the previous slide, really show how we start to derive this information from an entire organization and can start to share the data that I'm going to show you now. So this is what one of our models will look like. And we'll go into a live application of this because I want to show you an example of how these work and where there are some opportunities and actually where there's waste in an organization. What I want to share now is from the information that we derived, we can very quickly do this. I'm going to go through a couple of things on the right-hand side. We now can quantify, measure, and show how teams are communicating. And we can show the volume of those things in terms of virtual, physical, or a mixture of communicating. It's important to understand how this is happening because, again, the answers to and the solutions are going to lie in what the organization does with this information, but in some instances you may want more and more physical interaction, and in some cases you may want less or can be a little bit more decentralized. This is good information that can help that. We also want to know the volume of activity between these. And remember, because we can see how many people picked these interactions, we can quickly understand where are there high levels of interaction. And as you can see in the model on the left, some of these bars are very wide and some of these are very skinny, indicating, and it's very easy to see visually, who is interacting with who and what volume levels. And second to last, we can understand the prioritization. Remember, we asked people to prioritize those, and it doesn't mean that the last one that we picked, and I could have had 15 or 20 departments up there, or 2 or 3. It doesn't mean that the last one is not a priority, but it does mean that there are trade-offs in how we are making decisions with every hour that we have in the office and the energy that we expend in the organization. So there are lower priority interactions in the organization. And what we see in our models is that if individuals and teams all select a lower priority, it starts to self-identify for that team that perhaps this interaction isn't valuable to the mission and vision and purpose of the organization. I'm going to show you that in the live dashboard. And finally, on just those 2 questions and how we asked those, we can also understand the direction and the flow of information. Who's accessing whom? Are people coming to my team and my department to get information, to retrieve information, or to give us knowledge, for example? Or are we going out to share more information or knowledge or value throughout the organization? So these 4 things, the type, the volume, the priority, and the direction, are all of the different things that we can derive from how we tried to understand value networks in essentially minutes of time. So before we go into the live dashboard, which I'm just going to talk about a little bit, we're going to talk about how to now analyze and look at these networks. And there's really a few ways to look at this. Number one, when you're looking at visual data at its core and it's kind of its client-facing way that it's on the screen right now, look for things that are high interaction, because it indicates a high volume, and we all know that a huge amount of money and dollars are going into those interactions. I'm not suggesting yet that they're right or wrong, but know which ones those are. Also look for low interaction. It can reveal all kinds of different things. It can reveal siloed entities or departments within an organization. It could also indicate something that might be broken, people are not able to access them, or it may simply be that specific department is not as closely aligned with the rest of the organization and perhaps the way that they work and work style. So look for high interaction and low interaction. Also, understand your critical teams and then their priorities. Every organization knows by and large, CEOs, C-suite executives know where money is made in their organization. They can tell you it's Department A, it's Department B, it's these people. If these people work well, then we make money. So it's very easy to go in then and look at that specific team and understand who they prioritize working with. And if you want to flow more money and value through that team, pay attention to who's supporting them, and you can increase the throughput of the value that's built and the revenue that's generated for your organization. It's, in a way, it's that simple. There's a lot of complexity here, but in a way, it's that simple. Put everything where you're making money and building value.
It may not even be just making money, Kevin. It may be where innovation and new ideas are spawned. Isn't that right?
Building value, absolutely. Very important. Yep. Yeah. And again, the executives who derive the strategic plans and who kind of lead that vision for the organization, they know whether they need more innovation or productivity in these things, and they can pinpoint these things. And the whole organization can when they look at data like this. Also then look at low priority interactions, and we're going to show some of that next as we get into the dashboard. So now we're going to go into our live dashboard to show a little bit of how this data kind of comes off and share some of these things that I shared on the previous screen regarding high interaction, low interaction, priorities, and these types of things. And you will notice as we flip over to the other screen here, and this is a live dashboard and a data set, and I'll show you some things here that are going to reveal the different interactions. So what we're looking at here on the left-hand side of the screen is the value network for an organization of 195 people, which is designated in the upper right-hand corner here. So if we focus over here, I'm going to show you as I go over this dashboard, that as I go over, I can kind of see, and it lights up a little bit better to see what these interactions for. And as I hover over each of these different departments very slowly so that you can see them, you will see that some of these teams have very few networks. They rely on other teams and other teams solely. But you will also notice that there are some of the teams in this organization that rely on many other teams. And I'm going to get to one here in a second, and we're going to tell a little bit of a story. So if you see as I hover over each one, and hopefully you can follow, you can see these interactions. Now we can break these down, and I'll do that in a second. But now I'm going to come back to what this department is here, this IT department. And as I hover over them, look at how that lights up, like I like to say, like a Christmas tree. And it's really interesting. And here's the story about this organization. This is an organization that is 40 years old, and they have grown from a product-based organization developing land and buildings in the healthcare services industry and retirement care industry for years and years. So it was all land and product and building for 40 years. What they have found out in the last 10 years that they're going from this product to this service orientation now. And the service orientation which they now needed to pursue in the marketplace to be one of the best in the entire United States was technology based. So the reason that IT lights up like this, and we were thrilled to see this, is that IT became integral to the organization. So 10 and 20 and 30 years ago, IT simply got, I'm oversimplifying, but they got computers hooked up. They ran systems and all the back of house stuff. In the last decade, and now looking forward, IT had to change the way they were working from that mentality to, we have to find out what's best to use in the industry. We have to identify technologies that we can use to serve our clients. Thus, IT was integral and actually a huge fabric of generating revenue and creating and innovating new revenue for this organization. And you can see it because of the volume of activity they have with these different departments. Now what I want to show next is, I'm going to break this down and I'm going to look at that department, the IT department by themselves, and hone in on just one more thing there. So if I go down on the right-hand screen here, and in our application, select just the IT department to look at that, and then collapse this window. We're now going to see just the IT department by itself. And so this shows all of their interactions now a little bit more clearly, and we can do this with any demographic. within this suite of data. But now when I hover over them, I can see a little bit more clearly the deep banded lines with dark color. And remember, we said that those were the higher priorities, and the lighter banded lines, which are over here. And I'm going to talk about system support and IT, because a lot of interaction, in fact, the highest interaction is happening between the IT department and system support over here. However, it is deemed not a high priority interaction, and I'll tell you why. There's a story behind it, and the story in short says, system support is a legacy department within the organization, which is trying to get out of its own way, but it cannot. So there's a lot of interaction because the interaction is steeped in the history of the organization, but the IT department, and then through facilitation, the system support department said, yes, we really essentially aren't adding as much value to the organization as we used to, and IT has actually taken over a lot of that. So what happens then is there are people in the system support department who actually can navigate and transfer that energy over into the IT department, but there's other elements of that system support department which we realize don't need to be there. And the system support department represents about $1 million a year in compensation. So that $1 million can be taken and put into another more valuable component of the organization. Training and development, remanaging, reorganizing. That's how we find waste and move that into better processes and relationships in the organization. And you can't really see that unless you derive this information and use these teams to share that information in this manner. And now everyone's working on the good solutions.
And that becomes much more powerful, compounded insight when we're combining that one model that we're examining today with all of the other tools in the WPA dashboard. We can begin to understand what kinds of work behaviors people are engaging in and all sorts of other intelligence that we've collected. Isn't that right, Kevin?
Yeah, that's right. And it's true to say that we hardly ever look at these value networks in and of themselves, although we've had big Fortune 500 organizations who have simply said, do a value network analysis for it. But normally, we're looking at these networks and these relationships in addition to looking at their work dynamic model. So how much do they collaborate? Or looking perhaps at a mobility model or a culture model. You're correct.
Yeah, and I was just, I guess, teeing up this set of strategic questions for you with my comment, but sometimes it's the value network analysis by itself, but more often it would probably be a combination of the insights that we're gathering and the intelligence that we're using that'll give us a full picture and can help the leadership team ask these questions.
Yep. And these are simple questions. At WPA, we're fairly systematized and fast in gathering this information. But again, anyone who's doing strategic planning or facilitating or helping their team self-diagnose and understand how they can evolve and be better really are asking these basic questions. So are these relationships that we have correct? Is this truly where we want our energy to flow? And if not, let's create change by involving the team and having them self-diagnose and say, well, I'll tell you exactly why this is. If we didn't have to do this, we could do that. Hugely helpful in moving organizations forward very swiftly, and we see it all the time. Now, are these relationships really aligned to our mission, strategies, and vision? As I showed you, the IT department was clearly aligned to the purpose, mission, and new strategy and vision of the organization. 100% aligned. But as we saw that the other department, the system support, was really no longer aligned and no longer needed. And it's beautiful to identify those things. So when we can answer those questions, it creates clear action. So we need a little training, coaching, development. We might need to evolve our organizational structures a little bit differently within the organization. We perhaps need to invest in technology that can increase interaction or motivate interaction between teams and allow that to happen even better. And then the last one, which I really like, and I know Stephen Smith, who's on the call, really has taken a liking to, is the work environment and workplace strategy. Simply understanding who should work together and who might not be working together, co-location, changing the environment so these bump ins and these nudges and the interactions happen within the workplace. And you can see it with the data, and now you have a path forward. So there's just a couple of slides left, and I want to share them, and I want to highlight, we've shared this back in maybe April, May, June, I can't remember, but it's great. And it's simply that execution is a people problem, and this came out of this comes out of a lot of thought that says, look, at strategies to a certain extent are not difficult to figure out and understand. We put a lot of time and energy and money into those. But the problem is that execution is difficult. And the reason execution is difficult is because people are doing all kinds of different things. Data like we've shared this year that you can do, and you can go back and look, and we'd be happy to share kind of how to do it with anyone. The execution comes from looking at that data and making sure that we're aligned. So one last thing, we're at the bottom of the hour, and I want to share this because as I was working on the webinar, I thought, wow, this would be nice to share. Companies that excel at people analytics do these things. And this is just kind of a last share. They focus on business. The HR leaders are involved, and they're well balanced, and they see things at a very high level, and they see things in terms of the business. They're able to leverage company-wide resources, so they're not working in a silo. They are working with the entire organization and on behalf of the business, and they focus on the actionable. And then also, companies that excel at people analytics do these things. They make things visual. We shared visual evidence and stories. They think long-term, so nothing happens overnight. We're all dealing with people here. People are dynamic. Things change. Always put the people at the center of the equation, because that is your production, that is your revenue, that is your value generation. Communicate those successes and don't be afraid to fail. Be a learner. But I thought I'd share those kind of as our last webinar of the year, and that will kind of close us out here for the.
Before you jump off that slide, I just think that's a terrific way to conclude. Organizations are, involving themselves in so many different tools and techniques for trying to accomplish one or two of these things, but really WPA's work in people analytics can help an organization, no matter what its readiness or preparedness with all of these things. It's a multifaceted solution, and bringing together all of these tools in the WPA toolbox can help a leadership team prepare its organization for future change and accomplish these things with its human capital.
Right. Thanks, Tom, and thank you to everybody domestically in the United States. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody, and for everybody else around the world, thank you for joining us as well. And we do look forward to sharing more on these little half-hour webinars in 2018, because it's been really successful and great to do.
And thank you, Kevin. Appreciate all of our attendees for making time to join us today. We'll see you again in 2018. And if you have questions, please do submit them. We'll respond offline just to save time. And there may be a quick survey at the conclusion of our webinar when we sign off. We'd certainly appreciate your input and comments on this webinar series. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.